Git, a distributed source control repository. I try to picture clusters of information as they move through the file system. Were the commit messages like history books? I kept dreaming of a repository I thought I'd never see. And then, one day, get real.
This is Get Real. You made it to the final level. We're going to talk about history and configuration. In the previous levels, we've used git log repeatedly to see a list of our recent commits. Those commits usually include the SHA, hash, then the author, the date, and the commit message. The output from log is not usually the most easy thing to read, so we're going to go over a couple of ways to improve the output. The first thing you should do if you haven't already done it is to turn UI colors to true. It will emphasize your commit hash every single time. You can also format the output for the log differently. So if you pass in git log -- pretty one line, it will display one commit per line with the SHA at the beginning and the commit message right after. Even better, you can format the output of the log exactly how you want it by using format. You can use a bunch of placeholders to organize the output of each commit in your log. If you want to look at what each commit changed in the log output, you can use the git log -- one line p for patch output, and that will show you what lines were removed and what lines were added for the files that were modified during each commit. Git log one line stat will show you how many insertions and deletions were made for each file included in each commit. If we use the graph option, we'll get a visual representation of the branches and the commits on them so that maybe you could see your merge bubbles. It's not always useful to have the entire log history right there, so what you can do is specify a range between a certain date and another date where you want to see the log. You can also limit the log output based on time, using flags like until a minute ago, since 1 day ago, since 2 weeks ago, or between a month ago and until 2 weeks ago. As you saw previously, git diff can be really useful to see what has changed since our last commit. You can see the removed lines and the added lines in the files that were included. Git diff head does exactly the same thing as git diff. If you want to see the difference between the files now and 2 or 3 or 5 commits ago, diff gives you the following commands to do that. You can also compare two different commits, such as the second most recent against the most recent. If you remember those commit SHAs that we saw in the log, you can use those as well to compare between two commits specifically by naming the SHAs. Sometimes you'll see these SHA hashes abbreviated on places like GitHub. You can also use these abbreviated SHAs to run diffs, and you can also use branches to run diffs. So for instance, you could say git diff master bird if you had a bird branch you wanted to compare against. Finally, just like git log, you can use time-based ranges for git diffs. When projects go on for a while, sometimes you come across a change that has been made in a file that you really can't understand, and a good tool for that is git blame. You can run git blame and file name to see all of the changes on each line and who made them, when, and which commit created that change. So let's move on to some more advanced configurations. There may come a time in a project when you need to work on a specific folder, but you don't want to include this folder inside your repository and share it with your other coworkers. In this case, we have an experiments folder that we want to exclude from our local repo, but not exclude from elsewhere. What we can do is put that experiments folder inside of the git info exclude file. Just put the name of that folder in there, and when you run git status, you won't see that folder anymore. You can also use exclusion patterns in that file. You can specifically exclude the tutorial.mp4 file or all files that have the mp4 extension. You can exclude a whole folder like we saw. You can also exclude every log file inside of the log directory. Speaking of logs, nobody should ever include log files inside of a repository. Why? Because they always change differently depending on who's using the application. So what you want to do is use, instead of an exclude, a git ignore file, which will ignore all log files not just in your local repository, but also for everybody else. So here we have a server log file that we want to not have in our repository. We're going to put log/star.log so that any log file in that logs folder will never get included. And then we'll run git status. As you can see, there's no log file showing anymore. And then just commit that. One thing we haven't covered up until now is how to remove a file from your repository. So you can use the git rm command and then pass it a file or a folder. If you do git rm readme, it will remove your readme and then add that change to the stage. And you simply can commit remove readme and that file will now disappear. But in the case of log files, if you were already tracking the file, you don't want to delete it from your file system. All you want to do is tell Git stop caring about this file, stop tracking it. To do that, you can use git rm -- cached, which will stop watching for changes, stop tracking the file. After that, if you do git status, you'll see that it's deleted the same way, but it won't be deleted from your file system. And after you've untracked that log file, you can do the same git ignore and commit, and no more log files will be tracked. In level 1, we saw some basic configuration for the user and the email. Let's look at more configuration details that you can have. You can configure a specific merge tool if you want to see merge conflicts in a better way. There's also a very useful feature if you're working with Windows or Unix systems that will convert files to the Windows or Unix formats once they're committed. Then when you run config -- list, you'll see your global email first, and then the email specifier for this repository second, which overrides the previous one. You can verify this by running git config user.email inside of your repository, and it will show you which email is set for this repository. Then it will show you which email it's currently using. If you remember the log formats we went over in the beginning of this level, there's a bunch of really tricky options you can pass to them, and it's really hard to remember that all the time. What you can do, though, is create an alias to these log output formats. So for instance, you would use a special mylog format that triggers log pretty format and has a custom format. Another popular output format for Git log is the lol format, which will show you a graphical output, just like we saw before. Here we have a mylog format that gives us a nice output without having to pass any options. You'll notice as you use Git every day that the same commands keep coming up over and over again. You use git status, you use git checkout, you use git branch and commit. But you can alias those commands to shorter ones by doing the following. So now if we simply type git st, we can see the git status output. So that's it for level 7. You have the last stretch of challenges ahead of you, and we'll see you guys in the wrap-up video.